And that takes us to resolution number 2017-42, a resolution commenting on the State of Alaska Marijuana Control Board proposed regulation concerning on-site consumption of marijuana or approval of designated areas for on-site consumption at licensed retail marijuana establishments. Sponsors are Assembly Members Gray, Cooper, and Davies. It's on page 178 of your packet. And who would like to give a staff report? Mr. Gray, would you like to?
I'll start.
Your name's
Sure.
first on the list.
Yes, I'll start. Okay, so this resolution is a rewrite of the previous resolution quite thoroughly in that this time around we are actually trying to provide some sort of meaningful comment to the state control board about their proposed regulations for on-site consumption. Again, I have to reiterate that, but by entertaining this resolution, we are in no way, shape, or form either condoning on-site consumption or approving on-site consumption. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and have on-site consumption in Fairbanks. That is, again, another conversation for down the road when and if the state approves these regulations and when and if it is ruled that they have the authority to approve such regulations. So, again, we're trying to make some meaningful comments here. I know there's some trepidation on both sides, and I look forward to hearing from the public because we wanted to make sure and open this up for public comment. We didn't have to, but felt that it was in the best interest to have everybody's voices heard on this. So I'll defer to Mr. Cooper and Mr. Davies if they'd like to add anything.
Mr. Cooper.
Sure. Just briefly, I think Mr. Gray summarized it well. I think as you may recall, when the prior resolution was up, one of my main concerns was that it was just a blanket, we want on-site consumption regulations adopted, but it didn't go into actually critiquing what the regulations were. I had some specific concerns about the regulations. And one of the important, so as you'll see, the resolution is pretty straightforward. One of the concerns is making sure that there's local control, because this will, if the state Marijuana Control Board adopts regulations allowing on-site consumption, the issue is going to be back and forth in front of this assembly again to consider. So if they are going to adopt regulations, we wanted to make sure that there was some support for local control over how that is enacted. I think the other just kind of high-level issues, not too long ago, this assembly adopted an ordinance supporting the smoke-free workplace, and as a statewide effort. And I think that it's important that the regulations reflect that. And then kind of the third one was, this assembly has heard a lot of talk about the problems, not with on-site consumption, but with marijuana cultivation operations and the odor issues that result from that. So that was another topic that the resolution addressed. And it was one of these situations where I didn't think that this assembly was likely to pass a resolution supporting or condemning on-site consumption either way. And so to me, it made sense that in the absence of just a all-out yes or an all-out no, to take some time to make some meaningful comments on what the regulations might look like. Because if the Marijuana Control Board does adopt regulations, I think it's incumbent on us to comment on them. So that's where I was coming from with this.
Thank you. And Mr. Davies, do you wish to add anything to the staff report?
No, I think that it's been pretty well covered. There's a couple of other areas, but I think they're covered by the local regulation piece, so that I just want us to make sure that we retain that power if it goes forward. And I just want to underscore the fact that this is really neutral about whether or not we should have it. It's just saying if it happens, then these are some things that we are concerned about.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to open public hearing. I have 19 people signed up. So we're going to go through the same process. I'm going to call you as you fall on the list. I'm going to ask you to take, you'll have 3 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to stick to that 3 minutes just as much as you can so that everybody can have an opportunity to speak before it becomes like midnight and we start losing people. So first we have Christine Robbins, and second we have Jean Olson. So if you'll both please take the chairs, we appreciate it. Please give us your name and address for the record, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Okay, my name is Christine Robbins, R-O-B-B-I-N-S, 1340 Arctic Turn Drive, Fairbanks 99712. First off, I'd like to thank Guy Statley for all his years of service to our community. Thank you, sir. Now to comment on what's before the board, and I'm just going to reiterate what's in here, but and also bring up some other points. I would ask you not to promote or pass on the recommendation to the Marijuana Control Board of on-site consumption. There's quite a few good reasons why it shouldn't be here. Number one, there's no statutory authority. I've read all of it this time, Statute 17, and there's nothing that says you can. And if we wanted to do this the right way, it would be by a vote of the people or through some legislative process like that. Number two, it clearly states that there is to be no consumption in public and a $100 fine if they're caught. That's 173820. Number four. Number three, it needs to be regulated like alcohol. This was the promise in 2014. Nowhere can you buy packaged alcohol and drink it on site. It's dangerous because consumer and seller are both prone to mistakes. Number five, we would be the only state to allow on-site consumption. Why hasn't any other state? Where's the research of what these other states have gone through as to why they wouldn't want that? Where's the analyst that anyone has called in to make this recommendation that no other state has allowed? Why are we going to be the guinea pig? Our state isn't doing due diligence regarding the spread of such a controversial drug. What's the driving motivation behind flooding Fairbanks with psychotropic substances? Money? Number six, we're going to see an increase in accidents involving marijuana impaired drivers, which has been the case in Washington and Colorado. Now I submit if it were to be approved, number one, it needs to exclude concentrates and edibles. These can be widely abused and are far more dangerous than smoking as they are higher in THC and stay longer in the body with longer effects. Number two, limitations of sales based on THC potency. Where's the regulation for the single most affecting factor of this drug? Number three, prohibit the removal of unused marijuana product purchased for consumption. Number four, no sale of food or beverages with it. Number five, transportation of patrons to and from the premises. This will be yet another example of how a drug will prove to be a burden on the taxpayer. Number six, ventilation issues and spread of general stench. People delude themselves into thinking it can be contained or done away with, but anyone that ever had to deal with tobacco smoke knows that this just isn't so. And I leave you with this question. Sorry, I'm nervous. I think someone needs to be asking and answer, if the borough supports this, will it jeopardize any federally funded subsidy?
Wow, you have beautiful timing. So let's see if there are any questions for you, Ms. Robbins. I don't see any. Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming down and your testimony. Next, I have Vivian Stiver for the empty seat. Ms. Olson, your name and address for the record, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Jeannie Olson, 1890 Hollowell Road, North Pole. Briefly, the title caught me by surprise, and I started pretty startled by the title of the resolution, but then when I started reading the meat of it, it was a little more clear that it wasn't to promote on-site consumption. It was more clear that they just want a clarification with the board. So that made me calm down a little bit. So that's how I feel about it now. Is like, okay, now what we're just doing, I understand, is that through all the legal terms, we are just asking, as the borough, we're asking the state to say, would you please clarify this? And I'm a little concerned that the clarification is going to be that the board will then say, yeah, well, we've decided that on-site consumption will be okay, and it's up to the local communities to decide. So we'll be back to voting again, I'm assuming. And I feel kind of a little bit like, oh my gosh, we're back to this again. And I would say that my sense of the community is it will be defeated if it goes to the city or the community vote. We think that probably as a general community, 2-1, obviously, that it's okay to have commercial marijuana, but as I suspect from people that I've talked to, it's not okay to have on-site consumption. That's not what we voted for originally. But it'll be okay. It's the process to get clarification. And so we'll move along, I guess. That's it.
Thank you. Let me see if you have any questions for you. Mr. Tacky has a question for you.
Thanks for coming down, Ms. Olson. Do you have a reason then for why you would not be opposed to on-site consumption?
Well, the smoking is obviously the whole part about the smoking on-site consumption and just inhalation by employees and other people, just like cigarettes in that respect. I have no doubt that on-site consumption or shortly after on-site consumption already happens, but to actually condone it as a community, it just doesn't make sense to me. I know of a lot of people that take it and they only take it at home because they know that the effect of it is too profound for them. I also know that back in the days when there was the hippies in Woodstock, the marijuana, the THC in the plants was not nearly as potent as it is now. I mean, genetic engineering has really made that profound. So I just worry about it a little bit. I still appreciate personal rights, and so I voted yes for that. But I would probably myself even vote no for on-site consumption. I just think it's just another thing will add to the community, and I just can't. I've read the reasons why, and I just can't see why they would be. I don't know why you wouldn't just take it home. It's just like, why would I buy a 6-pack of beer and then sit out there in my car and drink it?
Thank you. Oh, Mr. Tacky.
So I guess my question then would be, if you were a tourist and you didn't have a home here,
I would take it to my hotel room.
where you aren't permitted to consume it.
Well, I don't know about that. I was in Denver and a couple of years ago, and it was an Airbnb, and I don't take marijuana. It doesn't work anyway. But for me. But the host or the guest said, "Would you like some of this pot?" And I said, "No, thank you." And she said, "I have all this pot because I have all these tourists. They come, they're so excited, but they buy too much, and then they can't take it back with them on the plane. So she has all this." I said, "You should just start a store, I guess. I don't know." So I mean, it happens. I know it happens.
Mr. Quist.
Thank you. So we had some testimony earlier against on-site consumption from a couple about marijuana and alcohol. And I was curious, I mean, do you feel the same, that there should not be on-site consumption of alcohol?
We get a lot of trouble with bars, don't we? I mean, we really do. We're not responsible. As a community, if we didn't have an alcohol problem and DUIs, I'd maybe entertain the fact that maybe we might be okay. But, we can't, we don't show that as a community we're responsible. And I think until we can show that, I'm not sure we should have this conversation. I think it's fine that we do have the conversation, but, it's just discouraging for me that people drink and drive, and they'll probably smoke and drive. And I don't know what the effect is, but I can say that a retired judge was out at my clinic a couple months ago, and that was before the vote, and they said, in my courts, I never saw domestic violence from pot. It was all from alcohol, so that's probably true. I'm not a judge, but happy little guys that are smoking pot, I don't know if they remember to stop at the light or not. I don't know. I've never been under the influence. I can't tell you, but I would worry about it, and I think we just need to somehow, as a community, become more responsible, and then maybe it'd be okay. I'm just glad it's legal, to tell you the truth. That's a hurdle, and maybe we should stop at that right now.
Okay, let's see if there are any other questions. Seeing none, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming down. And next we have John Rathbun, perhaps? I apologize. I can see I've mutilated that a little bit. Ms. Stiver, your name and address for the record. You'll have 3
Vivian
minutes.
Stiver, 523 2nd Avenue, Fairbanks, Alaska. This is good to get clarity from the state on these issues from the Marijuana Control Board. The curious thing when, the focus, of course, is the on-site consumption is the big concern here. So already the Marijuana Control Board said no to smoking lounges for marijuana. And so now we're repackaging this as retail, on-site, kind of test your product, whatever. So it is interesting that the Alaska Association of Police Chiefs have come out against on-site consumption, and for a very interesting reason. Apparently, there was a study done where someone being in a room that was well ventilated with people smoking marijuana was not smoking did test positive for THC. And so when you're going to have, should this on-site consumption happen, you have people who, again, are intoxicated, whether it's alcohol or marijuana, they're intoxicated. And as you know, there are 3 strands of marijuana: hemp, sativa, and endicott. Sativa has been known to cause violence in people in their behavior. Frank Turney agreed with Joe McGuire from Colorado that indeed he has seen people on that, and they do go crazy. So what's going to happen is you'll have these areas, you have people who will react differently to the product. When you go in today, they will ask you and tell you, take 1 or 2 hits, dose up slowly, because no one can tell you how that marijuana is going to affect you. They can't standardize the effects of marijuana for any one person, so you don't know what you're going to get. So you're going to have these possibly smoking areas, and then our first responders have to go in there. And of course, they're in a safety-sensitive job. They cannot consume marijuana. If they test positive for THC, well, then they have to justify kind of where it came from. Oh, yeah, I answered that call last week down at the marijuana pot shop on Cushman. One of the 3, I think, that are on Cushman, soon to be 4. So then he may or her be put on administrative leave until they can identify, did he or did she consume on her personal time? So first responders will be exposed to the THC and the smoke and the marijuana, and that's not acceptable in their job and their position. And it's not like alcohol, because I can drink it and only I'm drinking it. When you're smoking, it goes out to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stiver. Let's see if there are questions for you. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming down.
Thank you.
So in our empty seat, could we have Steve Cloutis perhaps? Mr. Rathbun, your name and address for the record, please.
My name is John Rathbun.
Thank
I
you.
live at 829 3rd Avenue, Fairbanks, Alaska 99701.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for providing a hearing on this subject of on-site consumption. And some of my talk may bring up some review of what others have already said. So some of my thunder is stolen, but please take to heart the fact that I'd like to review some of these other things in my own words. I know that there's no place in America where purchasing a quantity of marijuana can also provide the place where you can smoke it. So we will be the only ones doing that. So I wish you'd consider that. My concern is that we're going to be subjecting our community to a potentially dangerous experiment. Some of those topics have already been mentioned. Alcohol and marijuana are often compared to. Alcohol establishments don't sell quantities and allow drinking. There is a difference between alcohol and marijuana in that alcohol, people can choose to drink and someone next to them will not be affected. But marijuana is not like that. It's in the air. And when someone is in the vicinity, they'll also be smoking, basically. I'm here to implore you to protect our neighborhoods and reject this on-site consumption. People's health and lives are at stake. This will also require additional policing, which will be an expense to our community. So I wish you would consider supporting the rejection of on-site consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rathbun. Let's see if we have any questions for you. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming down. Thank you very much. And in the empty seat, if we can have Ann Dougherty, perhaps. Mr. Cloutis, your name and address for the record, please.
Steve Cloutis, 1465 Hans Way, Fairbanks.
Thank you.
I'd like to say that I do not see this resolution as neutral. Given its genesis, it appears to be designed to lay the groundwork for the on-site consumption and that for the borough to consider. If any comment should come back, I think it should be that the Marijuana Control Board is exceeding its authority on-site consumption is not an allowed use in the founding legislation, and asking for clarity on how it's going to be allowed when it's not allowed by law, I think is disingenuous on the Assembly's part. Face it, people take marijuana to get high, and on-site use is going to put impaired users on the street. You know, and do we really want people getting high in pot parlors and then driving off somewhere? Yeah, bars are a big enough problem, but at least we do have measures on the books to try to limit it. Bartenders cannot serve drunken customers. They face serious consequences if they do. Here in Alaska, there's no THC limits on marijuana. Concentrates can be added to edibles. They become extremely potent. They can kick in long after the drug's been ingested and last for hours. There's no way on-site monitoring can prevent inebriated, stoned drivers from going out on the road. Alcohol also has a testable driving limit of 0.08% blood alcohol content. That limit's been lowered over the years again and again to make sure that it includes any minor level of alcohol impairment. But there is no test whatsoever for marijuana impairment. Drunken drivers can get caught, they can get tested, and face serious consequences. There is no test for marijuana. The police have no way to test for stoned drivers, so stoned drivers face little legal risk. I just cannot understand why the borough would be interested in trying to facilitate a dangerous situation like that. I mean, as other people said, why isn't it good enough that people can get stoned at home? Why do we want to create and foster increased DUI in our town, especially in a manner that is not legal or allowed anywhere else in the United States? Eventually, when somebody gets hurt or killed by a stoned driver coming back from a pot parlor, I think the Assembly has got to look at itself and see how much of the blame do we have on our own hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cloudis. Are there questions? Yes, Mr. Tackey has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Cloudis. Have you had a chance to read the regulations that we're commenting on?
To read the control board's regulations?
Yes.
Suppose no, I have not. I don't think they have any legal authority to even put forward those regulations. It's not an allowed use in the law.
Right. I was just going to mention that inside their bud tenders are not actually allowed to provide product to already intoxicated individuals or people that show signs of already.
Well, what I was bringing up here is there is no objective way to measure if people are intoxicated or will be very soon after leaving the premises.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much for your testimony. And I have Holly Burrell for the empty seat, please, and Ms. Dowdy.
Hi, I'm Annie Doherty.
Thank you.
And I reside at 2216 Penrose Lane in Fairbanks. And earlier this evening, we heard testimony from June Rogers, and she's no longer here, but I would like to publicly thank her for the work she's done in Fairbanks over these many years. She's always been a positive influence, wanting to create a positive community here in Fairbanks for all of its residents. And some of the things she spoke about that she's worked on for years is a sobering center to promote wellness in Fairbanks. And we can all see why that's needed in Fairbanks because of the problem we have with substance abuse. She also talked about a drug take-back program to combat the supposed opioid problem. And she sees this as an end road to a serious problem that we face as a community. And she also commented that we're a few steps ahead of many other communities. Well, now we're talking about taking a few giant steps backwards. We're talking about on-site consumption. And when it does come to a matter, when and if, of local control, I would request that you consider your responsibilities in keeping Fairbanks a positive atmosphere and take into consideration the wellness of our community, not just the individual people in the community, but the community as a whole. We don't have data for our own community on the effects of marijuana, the legalization of marijuana. And before we start giving more allowances, we need to first be looking at the situation we have. So we should be seriously collecting data, analyzing data, and seeing where that data leads. If you look at other communities that have legalized marijuana, there are a 29% increase in emergency room visits, 32% increase in traffic fatalities due to marijuana, 38% increase in drug hospitalizations, 72% of marijuana exposure. Though there aren't specific data, but there is an increase in school expulsions. There's an increase in THC testing positive in drug tests in the workplace. So once marijuana has become legalized, then we will start seeing increases in our community as well, if we're looking for them. If we're just going to close our eyes and be blind, we're not going to see them. I implore you to be searching out for the data and analyzing that before you start making regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doherty. Let's see if there are questions for you. Yes, Mr. Tacky has a question for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you if you were aware of the fact that opioid fatalities actually are decreasing in states that have legalized marijuana. So it's like a safer route to help drug problems.
I have some problems with the whole opioid conversation to begin with. So that data may or may not be relevant to me. Yeah, I think there's a lot different issue going on, but if you were going to say that alcoholism has increased because of opioid becoming illegal or anything else, that really doesn't matter. That one thing is substituting another. If you were going to say that because marijuana has been legal, bank robberies have gone down, or because marijuana is illegal, bank robberies have gone up, those aren't necessarily related. And if opioid usage has gone down in those communities, that may be a piece of data, but that doesn't support that marijuana legalization is good.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming down. And next we have Frank Turney for our empty seat. Ms. Burrell, your name and address for the record, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Okay, yes, I'm Holly Burrell, and I live at 588 Golden Morn Drive. That's 99712. And thank you for allowing me to be here tonight, and thank you for all your work that you all do. I live 1.6 miles from Chena Hot Springs Road, the corner of Rainbow, where they meet. I know the distance because I've been running this route for the last 10 years on and off by myself, with my children, or others. 1 mile from Chena Hot Springs Road and where Rainbow meets is the first bus stop, where between 6:45 a.m. on up to 8:45 a.m., many young people wait for their bus. When I pass by and I say good morning, then I pass by the smaller bus that picks up the children in the neighborhood with special needs. Following the bus route down to Highlander, now going beyond or just short of 1 mile, another bus stop is on the corner. I then may run by the young guy who's a slow learner with his toy poodle and always a friendly wave. I go past Chelsea's farm, now a half a mile. The horses are out with another bus stop for children. I now run on down less now than a half a mile, getting closer to that corner by Chena Hot Springs Road and where Rainbow meets. As I work my way down closer to my turnaround at the stop sign, I pass 3 more bus stops on the left. A few more good mornings or wave to those who are waiting in the cold at times, many mornings, finally to make my turnaround Rainbow and Chena Hot Springs. As I turn there, there's once an empty lot, now with a trailer, for a marijuana shop that's waiting to open up soon, with only yards from bus stops. I just pass near the nearby trailer homes as the children are out. As I make my way back, the cars heading to work make room for me to run by with my dog as I wave and I thank them for being so considerate. I may even see that morning, if not that afternoon, while even the buses come back by, the older woman who walks slowly but steady from a possible past stroke, who enjoys picking up trash when she sees it. I've enjoyed this route for years, just long enough for a good run. Still a neighborhood filled with children and many parents who care, who are outside many times in the cold mornings waiting for their children to get on the bus with temperatures very cold, and especially that last route across from the trailer where their homes are. Do I write this, or am I here because I enjoy running? No. I'm against what the consumption would do there at the marijuana shop. I've spent most of my life being around children and young people who I enjoy and want to look out for. I've spent at the halfway house visiting, FCC visiting young women staying in our home, their children, their infants being in my home, my arms. I've encouraged many young women, many hours on phones, who have gone this route, and they'll tell you today, I wish I would have never had it. So I leave this with you. I ask that we be responsible adults who need to be looking out for what is best for the safety of our children in this community and those who cannot defend themselves instead of our rights to pleasures that are temporary. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burrell. Let's see if there are questions for you. Mr. Satley has a question for you.
Yes, ma'am. You've described a shop that's going to open up on Chena Hot Springs Road out in my part of the borough. We keep hearing from the advocates of this industry that this is aimed at tourists, that the tourists can't go back to their hotel rooms and smoke because of the hotel's rules, I guess. And they can't smoke this in public, I guess. And so they need a place inside to hang out and smoke. Can you imagine tourists showing up out, this is probably 5 miles from town, 6 miles from town, out there on Chena Hot Springs Road, next to the trailer court, in a mobile home, yeah. and wanting to hang around and buy pot and sit there on a sofa or something and smoke?
Well, I thank you, sir, for asking, and especially all your service all these years. But since you brought that up, there was just recently this past summer, I know a lot of the people rent the BMW motorcycles, and Rainbow Road is a really pretty road. It's like beautiful during the wintertime, and it's like when it freezes, it's a wonderland, winter wonderland. Really, it is. For that stretch of a mile, it's like a half a mile, and it's beautiful.
Is it full, full of tourists, though? I mean,
yeah, they do stop there. People run on that road. That's a pretty busy, actually, coming from Gilmore in that area. They do. But the thing is that
these people have homes. They can buy stuff and take it home, right?
Ask questions.
They could take this home.
Right. And that's what I'm asking is I don't think it's right if the shop opens up that they have that right, because it's been, not that I agree with it, but the thing is that what goes in the air, and like I said, I'm looking out for the children who are in that area.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Satley. Any other questions for Ms. Burley? Thank you so much. And I have Rick Hinkey for the empty seat. Thank you. Mr. Turney, your name and address for the record, please.
Yes, 329 6th and 7th Avenue. First of all, I was hoping those cupcakes had induced with cannabis in them, but I would like to say to the mayor, it would be nice to have on-site consumption from your borough employees. You got a nice lawn out there and tables, and maybe it'll relieve a lot of stress for you employees. Anyway, regarding on-site consumption, I do support that. And I did a lot of homework and research here, and I believe there's other states are initiating resolutions to do exactly that same thing. And they'll probably beat us before that does happen. As far as on-site consumption goes, I remember the higher calling. Right over here on, I believe it was, I got the address down here. It was right behind the Chevron service station, not very far from the courthouse here. And I went in there many times, and I noticed that ventilation in there. You could hardly smell the cannabis in the air. I would know if I could smell it. And wow, you had music in there. People come in there. You had a pool room. You had a rec room. People were eating edibles and smoking. And I didn't see any aggressive behavior whatsoever. I didn't see people urinating on the sidewalk as they left. And I noticed they didn't sell any cannabis at that residence. But that's what I looked at as an on-site consumption for people to share, just like the tap house downtown. The city just authorized that tap house downtown. You think of all the drug problems we've had in Fairbanks. Of course, that's that freedom to drink alcohol. And I noticed I went down there today, and those people, and they're enjoying having a beer and enjoying themselves. And I think that's what it's all about when it comes to cannabis. I heard so many stories here regarding THC level. I remember the 60s, Acapulco Gold, Panama Red. The THC was much higher than it is today. Much higher, believe me. I don't know where these guys get their information, but in the 60s, Panama Red and Acapulco Gold was probably the highest THC you could find in the 60s. I don't know what the state's going to do with this, but I think eventually it's going to happen. I think the biggest thing here is just fear. A lot of people have fear. They don't even want to recognize that cannabis, the CBD, they're talking about children with asthma and all kinds of problems that the big pharma wouldn't help, and they're helping children out there. A lot of children with asthma, epileptics, attacks, and stuff like that. Myself, I've been smoking for over 30 years. I'm not bragging about it. I still got my faculties. I still got my memories pretty good. Ask me any questions, and I think I can answer those questions. And I enjoyed about 3 cannabis edibles before I come here. I'm feeling pretty good. Don't you think so?
Thank you, Mr. Turney. Okay. Let's see if there are some questions for you.
Oh, I doubt it. Anyway, thank you. Anyway, I want to thank Mr. Sadley and Mr. Davis for their service.
We agree. And you're right. I don't see any questions. But thank you for coming down. We appreciate it. Mr. Burley, we have for the empty seat, and Mr. Hinkie. Thank you. Your name and address for the record, please. You have 3 minutes.
Rick Hinkey, Hinkey, 1001 Lathrop, Fairbanks, 99701.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm coming to just speak to the on-site consumption idea. And I was here a few weeks ago when the resolution was defeated to, I can remember, encourage the MCB to consider it or whatever it was. It was defeated, I think, probably because there was not the right amount of people here that were for it. And so this is maybe why it's coming back again in a different iteration. But my concern is that the on-site consumption is not so much. I mean, it is the drug driving issue for sure. Having places to swing by on the way home from work to get high, that's publicly is not probably the best thing to do. I would discourage Mayor Castle on the on-site consumption for staff, only because maybe they wouldn't get anything done. They would be definitely less stressed out for sure. But then again, they may get a lot more done. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how it impacts different people. But one thing I do know is that smoke is smoke. And there has been a fight in big tobacco for literally decades about secondhand smoke, the impact of smoking tobacco. I know marijuana and tobacco is different. That's going to be one of the first arguments for sure. But there are similar carcinogens. There are similar toxins. You cannot filter out these toxins and these carcinogens. It's impossible to do that. They're so small, the particulates, that they're like a gas, not like a dust. And so you can't filter those things out. So secondhand smoke, whether it's cigarette smoke or marijuana smoke, is equally dangerous. And you can say, well, there's people that disagree with that, and usually they're big tobacco people that disagree with that. In a judgment back in 2006, Big Tobacco was directed by the Supreme Court to admit to the dangers of secondhand smoke because they had to release all of their internal documents, all of their own research, and they knew for decades that smoking killed people and secondhand smoke caused lung cancer. They knew that for decades, and they hid that and they lied about it. And the judge said, you have to tell the truth about that in 2006. And in 2017, just a few weeks ago, the tobacco company finally said, okay, we'll do it. We'll admit to it. And so you'll see in November some advertisements coming out on TV and the newspaper saying we lied about it. Secondhand smoke does cause lung cancer. And so that's a big win for us. And if you want to read about this, you can go to acscan.org, the Cancer Action Network, and you can read all about the litigation that's gone on for decades. You can read about some of the documents that the tobacco industry was trying to keep hidden and all that sort of stuff. Secondhand smoke is dangerous.
Thank you, Mr. Burley. I'm sorry, Mr. Hinkie. Let's see if yes, Mr. Tacky and Mr. Quist have questions for you.
Thanks for coming down, Mr. Hinkie. I had a question. Have you found any research that actually has a causation for cannabis secondhand smoke or even cannabis smoke causing any cancer?
I don't have it in my mind or with me, but there is some research out there, and it's pretty minimal compared to tobacco for sure. But there is research that shows the same toxins and carcinogens in both secondhand marijuana smoke and tobacco smoke. There's lots of research on secondhand tobacco smoke, obviously, not as much on marijuana smoke for sure.
Right, but what you did find, you say there is a very large difference then in what it would do to anybody. Like you said, it was smaller. The impact is much less.
No, the research is much less. Not so much the impact. Yeah,
I'd love to see the study that you have.
Yeah. I can.
If you can email it to
Sure.
the assembly, we'll share it. Thank you, Mr. Quist had a question for you.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I had this clear from you. You said that tobacco smoke and marijuana smoke are equally dangerous.
They're both detrimental to your health.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
to lung health.
I just wanted
to
to
breathing.
make sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I heard it equally, but what you just said is a very different statement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I can't say equally because, like I said, there's not as much research on the marijuana secondhand smoke as there is on tobacco smoke. So it's hard to say they're equal.
But I understand. I just wanted to make sure I had your views correct. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see. I don't see any other questions for you. Thank you for coming down. Let's see. We have Rita Leak in the empty seat, and Mr. Smoot. I'm sorry, you're Blake Burley. I'm sorry, Blake.
Yes,
it's
ma'am.
been a long evening. Mr. Burley, your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening, Blake Burley, 3079 Nuttall Lane, North Pole, Alaska, 99705. So I think it's always a strange thing, Mr. Tacky, when someone takes a very small minority, a very small piece of the puzzle and says, hey, look at this and let's apply it to the whole group. I think it's incredibly foolish for us to think that tourists' opinion is more important than ours. This is our community, Mr. Tacky. And no matter what tourists think, I don't care because they don't have to live here. And I think that's incredibly important for all of you to grasp, that we should not make laws based on what other people think or might do. This is our community. This is where we live. This is what's important to us. And as the communities come out tonight, I think it's very clear that we do not support on-site consumption of marijuana. So I think something else is very important that was pointed out before is the fact that there is so much ways that we can control alcohol in difference to marijuana in regards to driving under the influence and how detrimental this can be to our community. And I'm not here to be a proponent of alcohol and to say that alcohol is something meaningful to our community, because I shouldn't have to explain to anyone here that there are numerous dry villages in Alaska. Because we know it's a problem. We know inherently that alcohol is dangerous, and marijuana is no different. I can tell you firsthand from people that I know who've smoked marijuana that they become incredibly less productive. And there's no denying that. So here's my question, or maybe something that I'm going to hopefully provide an answer for, is why is it that there's drive villages throughout Alaska, but yet Fairbanks, Anchorage, Juneau, some of the larger communities aren't? And I think this is the downfall, the failure, if you will, of democracy, where we take the minorities and we fail the minorities by making laws that don't really affect me, and so I'm going to vote because I just want everybody to do what they want, and yet it affects the minorities. And small Alaskan villages can feel that impact. They can see when they're affected by their small group and they say, hey, we don't want this. I can tell you right now that we don't want marijuana. We don't want alcohol in our community. They're all incredibly detrimental, and I hope that you will put that forth to the Marijuana Control Board, that we don't want any of it.
Thank you, Mr. Burley. And I'm going to remind us that, we want to be respectful of those that we agree and disagree with this evening. Are there questions for Mr. Burley? Seeing none, thank you. I inadvertently skipped over Mr. Smoot. Do you mind if he takes the empty seat? Thank you. Fine. Thank you, Mr. Burley. Mr. Smoot, your name and address for the record, please, and you'll have 3 minutes.
My name is Nathan Smoot, S-M-O-O-T. My address 7220 Steese Highway, Fairbanks, Alaska 99712. I am against the idea of consumption. I do also recognize that the resolution is not a deciding for or deciding against. It's an attempt to remain neutral. Before I forget to do so, though, I do want to thank you all individually for your service. I forgot to do that the last time I was up here, and I do appreciate. I feel like it's a sacrifice when I come out here the few times that I come, and you guys are here every time the assembly is meeting. So, thank you for your service. Back to the ordinance, or not ordinance, but resolution. I would like to see the borough take a position on this rather than trying to remain neutral. As you send forward your resolution to the state board, I'd like to see you be active rather than have to wait and see what they come out with, and then we have to be reactive. So let's take a position. There are some things that I'd like to see on it. First of all, I'm opposed to the AMCB considering consumption establishments. I'd like us to, as Nancy Reagan said so often in the 80s, let's just say no. Let's say no to increasing our public intoxication problems that we have in the Fairbanks North Star Borough. Let me quickly address a few points. On number 1, it says the regulation should contain express language authorizing municipalities to regulate on-site consumption. I think you should add in there and prevent. There may be a desire for us to say no. Let's make sure that they give us that leeway. Number 3, I'm glad that you make mention of a smoke-free workplace. I think it's ridiculous that we talk out of one side of our face about smoke-free workplaces, and then on the other, we say let's make this a legal thing. Point 6, rather than considering whether outdoor consumption by inhalation should be permitted given potential conflicts with adjoining property owners over odor mitigation. Let's make that stronger, and let's say no. We don't want this in our community. We don't want the stench. We don't want the... It's impossible to control that in an outdoor environment. So let's say no. And as to a question that was asked previously about where a tourist is going to go, if the hotel that they're staying in doesn't support it, they need to find a different hotel.
Thank you, Mr. Smoot. That sounds like a possible commercial opportunity. Sorry, I have to turn my mic back up. Let's see if there are any questions for you. Seeing none, thank you very much for coming
Sure.
down. We appreciate it. So I have Julia Cox in the next empty seat, and Ms. Leek, thank you for your patience and your graciousness.
Rita Leak, 228 Farmers Loop Extension, Fairbanks 99712. First of all, I'd like to thank Guy Satley for his years of service. We've known him almost 30 years, and the friendship. And the Leak family wants to wish you the best in the following years. Also, Mr. Davies, thank you for your service. Although I didn't always agree with your vote or your direction, I thank God we live in a country that we can have freedom of speech and have the opportunity to come before all of you to make our community better. One of the things I'm wondering why we are even discussing on-site consumption when you haven't put forth any rules and regulations for marijuana. It seems that it's money. There's a couple of assembly members that have made huge profits from marijuana, and I think that's why they're trying to ramrod it through, because there's money. It's big money. I'm wondering about the dispensaries and the clerks who get that, sell marijuana, or the cookies or whatever it is. Are they liable? I think they would be. If a new smoker goes out and gets hit by a car, they're liable. Or if another one gets in their car and kills somebody, they're liable. So it's a good thing they make the profit because they're going to need it. In closing, how many growers and retail stores do we need? When is enough enough? We lead the state in growers and probably retail stores. So you have to decide how much is enough for our community. I mean, it makes me sick going down airport and seeing a marijuana shop right there with the big sign, big leaf. I mean, I'm not proud. I'm not proud of our city anymore because you have allowed that. You're all guilty that you voted to allow that. So, in closing, you seem to be rubber stamping everything. And if you pass it, I want to thank you for making Fairbanks the Mecca capital of stoners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Leek. I'm sorry. Thank you, Ms. Leek. Let me see. Mr. Quist has a question for you.
Thank you. You characterize this process as ramrodding, and I was hoping you could expound on that some, because what makes you feel that this process is ramrodding?
Well, let's see. The campaign for marijuana to keep it in our community, and then what's next? Since you're on the assembly, I don't think you should be allowed to vote on the on-site consumption because you produce it, or you grow it, or you sell it.
Yeah, I mean, you might be mistaking me with somebody else, but...
Are you not involved in marijuana?
No, I'm not.
Oh, you're not? Oh, you act like it. No.
Excuse me. Wow. Excuse me. Come on. I think point of order.
Point of order.
Yeah.
Point of order.
But
and I'd like my question answered.
Oh, I can't answer that.
Okay.
I don't know what your directions are at the assembly, but I feel like you're rubber stamping everything that comes before you.
No, Mr. Davies.
Well, just to, I just want you. I'll ask this as a question: Are you aware that none of the people that are sponsoring this resolution are involved in the industry at all in any way?
Well, no, I didn't know that. I can't figure out why they would do that.
Oh, that's a fact.
That's a fact.
I have nothing to do with the industry for myself, so
I can't.
I don't want. I just want to take personal exception to the characterization that somehow I'm profiting from this. I'm not at all.
Oh, I didn't say that you did.
So we're not going to debate here.
Thank you very much.
No, I understand, but she's clarifying that, right?
Yes.
That none of the sponsors are involved in the business. So, any other comments on this?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have Jackie Gengler, perhaps. I have Jackie Gengler in the next seat. Ms. Cox, your name and address for the record.
My name is Julia Cox. I live at 887 Sheen Hot Springs Road. I don't know much about the politics surrounding this, but I do know a lot about drug and alcohol addiction and drug and alcohol abuse. I was an addict myself. I've been around. I don't think marijuana was personally my only drug of choice, but I have been around a lot of people to where it was, and just because we don't see what's on the surface doesn't mean that it's not still destroying lives. I've seen men sit at home and spend all their wife's money on marijuana and make the wife go out and work. And I just gave a classmate a ride home the other day who told me that her marriage was falling apart because her husband was spending all the money on marijuana and yelling at her because the bills were not getting paid. And I have a family member addicted who would blow all his money on bongs and weed. And I've been in the car with him. He's ran stoplights. I myself have tried marijuana, and I, more than once, but one time I tried marijuana and I drove and I went the wrong way on the road because I was so out of my mind. I've had people tell me they hear voices on marijuana. My main concern is that children will, that I don't know the details, but will pass by the marijuana shops and smell it in the air. And, that gets into their mind. And when they're 21, and considering the stigma, the social stigma that surrounds it and the way it's been glorified, I think that when they're 21, they'll even be more likely to go to the pot shop and smoke marijuana right there because they're so excited that they're 21 and they can smoke marijuana. And that's getting into our children's minds now. And that's going to launch them into an addiction and probably lead to other drugs because it's all connected. And if it wasn't for the Lord Jesus Christ dying on the cross for my sins and rising and being buried and rising in the third day, then I wouldn't be able to stay sober. And it's not hard to call upon him to save you. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cox. Let's see if there are questions for you. Seeing none, we appreciate. I'm sorry. Thank you. And I do see a question for you, Ms. Cox. Mr. Roberts.
So have you ever known anyone whose life has become great and glorious because they started smoking marijuana?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming down. We appreciate it. I have next up Karen Bloom, if you'll take the empty seat, and Ms. Gengler.
Yes,
Please
ma'am.
give us your name and address for the record. You'll have 3 minutes.
Jackie Gangler, and my address is 2533 Micah Road, North Pole, Alaska, 99705. I am going to try to clarify my thoughts because I understand that this particular resolution, while not specifically authorizing things, does bring up the authorizing of on-site consumption as a topic for consideration. It's not separate from the possible future considerations. What you're proposing here is a resolution of things to consider, so of course it's already on everybody's mind how that's going to play out. I do believe that safety is a major concern for myself as well as my 5 daughters. I have 5 children. They're all daughters, 12, 14, 16, and 18. They are driving. They are new drivers. Some of them are not quite driving, but will be shortly. I think it's very relevant that the police chiefs have come out against this. I do think that public safety is a concern. I am not concerned about tourists. There are many, many prescription drugs and other things that people are not allowed to drive while impaired or not allowed to do in certain areas or other areas. That's why we have border patrol customs for various things going across. It's our laws for our people, and we need to do what we need to do to keep our people safe. And I do believe that this is not going in that direction. While I am grateful that there are recommendations in here for considerations of secondhand smoke and other things like that, I do not think it goes far enough as far as recommendations for things that should be limited. I found it really interesting, the first page. Currently, consumption of marijuana in or upon any public place is prohibited by the Alaska statute. And then in the next one, it says that the Marijuana Control Board is considering establishing regulations for it to be legal. Statutes are made to be put forth, I believe, by laws and things of that nature, are to be put forth by the Congress and not to be made by regulations. It's a problem I have with the federal government, and I don't want to see it perpetuated that changes to our operating guidelines to this extent are made outside the legislative process and are made by regulations. It's not limited to this, but this is an example of that.
Thank you, Ms. Gengler. Let's see if there are questions for you.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Satley has a question.
Well, on what you said there at the end, you think that if we were to pass this, even though it's making specific suggestions to the nuts and bolts of the rules in the future, that by passing this we are sort of giving the assumption that we favor it more than disfavor it. We're sort of. Are you saying it sounds like we are sort of tilting a little bit to the side of being in favor of this?
I'm saying that I'm not in favor of on-site consumption, and that I feel like that is a relevant point, given that this brings up that topic.
Right.
And I do think this does not go far enough. Where there's a continuum, and I'm not going to try and play the balance beam or the judge that says which way this body is going,
right,
given this particular one. I'm simply saying that I don't support on-site consumption, and I don't think that this particular resolution strongly enough expresses a concern for the public safety in that area.
I appreciate the comments. I agree with you.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much, Ms. Gengler. So after Ms. Bloom, we have Searles Isaac. Seals Isaac. Thank you. It looks like you. Ms. Bloom, your name and address for the record, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Karen Bloom, 1162 Park Drive, Fairbanks. Hello, esteemed members of the Assembly, and it's nice to be back here and see everyone present. As always, marijuana is bringing up a lot of emotions and conjecture, as it does. I would like to really get down to the black and white of the resolution versus the emotion behind whether or not we should have on-site consumption. Speaking from a point of business, this resolution is too broad and too vague. The state hasn't established what the regulations will read, so a preemptive strike of what we want in the borough really isn't in the benefit of either side of the industry or the prohibition side. Putting in order parameters to consider when you don't know what it is you're considering makes no sense to me. It's too vague and too broad. I will take this moment to point out that 70% of the vote was to have marijuana legal in the borough and the city. So the conversation around on-site consumption should continue, but we should wait for the state to provide the regulations so then the borough and the city can be clear about how they want to approach that. that really is my end point there, is that until we know how it will be regulated, it's really putting the cart before the horse to say, well, I really want to do it this way, or I really want to do it that way. It makes no sense. Let's wait until the state comes out with some clarity and then look at it objectively and decide how we want to approach it. I propose this resolution is put in the round file, personally.
Thank you, Ms. Bloom. Let's see if there are questions for you. Yes, Mr. Cooper.
I guess I'm a little bit confused by your testimony. Are you aware that the state has proposed draft regulations and this resolution is responding to those?
Yes, and I am also aware that they have not been approved. The public comment ends Friday.
Right, and are you aware that this resolution is an attempt to provide public comments, input into the legislative or rulemaking process?
I am aware of that.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see any other questions, Ms. Bloom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then I have someone who is at 2706 State something. Thank you. Please take an empty seat. My apologies. Thank you. Mr. Isaac, your name and address for the record, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Isaac Searles. Address is 1128 Holmes Road, North Pole, 99705. I'm appalled that this is even a question. We don't hire people that smoke marijuana in the police department because it might impair their judgment, but we'll allow it in our citizens. I'm a father of 3 and about to be 4. Like you, I've taken an oath to defend the Constitution to my death, and I do not take this lightly. But it is shameful when we don't stand for standards anymore. And it's all about the tax money. How much revenue we will bring in. This is shameful. This talks about, I got a letter here. It says, needs to be regulated like alcohol. Well, we haven't regulated alcohol. We've lost the fight to alcohol. We can't hire people. There are people trying to get jobs or because they have alcohol DUIs. We can't hire people. Increase in accidents. Don't I have enough to worry about? Are you ready for the numbers? The death toll? I was raised in Thailand, and I appreciate the right to freedom of speech. 26 years of my life, I grew up without a right to speak, a right to bear arms. Alcohol was rampant. I did search and recovery starting at 13. I was a rescue diver. My parents are currently now owners of an orphanage whose parents decided it was better to do alcohol and drugs. Are we ready for that? I volunteered my time for the food bank, and I see people coming with luxurious cars I can't afford, but they come to the food bank to get food. Are you ready for them to start taking their money that they're supposed to be buying food for their children to go buy drugs? This is even a question? It shouldn't even be an option. I buried 3 people a day in Thailand. 2 of those are usually either alcohol or drugs. I see those faces. And I wish you could too, because this wouldn't even be an option. The state wouldn't even allow it. Alcohol would be gone. If it cost the voters the money to pay for the funerals, to pay for the caskets, this would have never passed. But what happens when it costs me my family? When some driver, because he can't be tested for drugs, hits my family and kills one of them, you going to pay for it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Searles. Let's see if there are questions for you. Mr. Roberts has a question for you.
I just wanted to ask, based on the address you gave, if you knew that there was a cultivation place going in very close to you and it's being heard on November the 9th for their license in this assembly.
No, sir. That's very shameful. It's very saddening. North Pole people we can barely make it on jobs. And we're going to open a store? Really?
It's a cultivation.
Okay, we need more, right? Sir?
And did you know that you can come publicly testify then?
I plan to, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Greg Allison is in the empty seat, and perhaps Ed? No? Why don't you tell me your name? Give us your name and address for the record.
My name is Lyndon Anson. I live at 2406 Statehood Street, North Pole.
Thank you. Lyndon Hanson?
Anson, A-N-S-O-N.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Everybody's worried about on-site consumption and driving. Well, that's what taxis and DDs are for, right? If you're responsible about it, how can you take the right away from everybody that is responsible for the people that are not responsible? Myself, I have a cannabis business, and if I was to think of what my on-site consumption, if it was to be legal and what I would want there, it would be a tasting. It's not to smoke it. It's not to sit there and get high. No. It's to taste the product and to figure out if that product fits your palate and fits what you want. It's not consuming enough to get high. It's a tasting. It's a lot of the things they say, well, okay, you can't get smoke out of the air. Well, that's false. That's what air ionizers are for. You put the air ionizers in the smoke collectors. It's really what it comes down to is, it's what the people want. Put it out for vote. That's what happened last time. Put it out for vote. That's who decides, right? I don't even know how to explain it. I understand that this is all gathering information for what the state needs to make their decision, correct? Putting the guidelines on it already, I think, is a little quick. I think letting the state set it up, and if it passes, yeah, then set them up. Vote on them. Go from there. But why? Everybody seems to be getting worked up. Oh, this is terrible. This is not what we want. Well, the borough voted on it. It is what the majority wants. That's what the vote for is, right? To figure out what the majority of the people want. Do the same here. That's all I have.
Thank you. Let's see if there are questions for you. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming down. I have Nils Degerlund next. Thank you. Mr. Allison, your name and address for the record, please.
Thank you, Borough. My name is Greg Allison, and I reside at 1430 Porchette Way, Fairbanks, Alaska, 99709. And I understand this is a gray area here. That I can only hope that that dialogue continues and that the regulations are created that benefit both the people that are advocates for it and for those that are concerned about it. I'm from Fairbanks. I'm very proud to have gone and graduated from the university here and to have made my career in the hospitality industry. And I completely understand this is our town, and we shouldn't let visitors dictate what we're doing. But we should be cautious of what they would like to do while they're here, because the visitor spending in this town brings a lot of jobs and creates a lot of opportunity for folks. So I don't want to completely, disregard what the visitor and hospitality industry means to us. And all I can speak to is, as a responsible business owner, as many of you know, we do have a cannabis retail shop here in Fairbanks, and we're very proud to give back and focus on philanthropy. We had our first Friday several weeks ago, and a proceed of our sales went to the Stone Soup Cafe during that night. And we'll only continue to give back to the community that's supported us thus far. And we're proud members of Explore Fairbanks because we understand what it means to join organizations like Chamber and Explore Fairbanks and what it means to create meaningful partnerships. And we were very fortunate to have the State of Alaska Australian fam come into our shop several weeks ago. So we had 6 tour operators from the other side of the world come into our shop with nothing but smiles on their face, and ready to buy product. And we talked to them about, when you bring your visitors over here, because they send a lot of people, and that's just 6, all 6 of them were like, yep, we're going to send them your way. But we don't feel ethically that we could, sell to them because they can't consume responsibly in a hotel room or in public. So, like I said from the beginning, this is a very, very gray area, and I can just only hope that positive dialogue continues and that we trust our business owners to be responsible, to call Ubers, to call taxis, to create opportunities for them to make money, and to run our establishments in an ethical and sound manner. And that's the best we can do, and I hope that you guys continue to trust us as business owners, that we're doing what's right for our community, for those that do advocate for our industry, and for those that don't as well. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Let's see if there are questions for you. Mr. Gray and then Mr. Roberts.
Oh, okay. I just was wondering your thoughts on this particular resolution itself.
I just I hope that you can create guidelines that protect everybody involved. As we create these business these opportunities within our business walls.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Roberts.
So, are you saying that Explore Fairbanks accepts marijuana businesses as members?
We are a member of Explore Fairbanks, yes, and we had to watch our verbiage very closely and work with them to do so. Yes.
Thank you.
Just like the Chamber allowed the Alaska Marijuana Industry Association Fairbanks chapter to become members of them, we should be normalized. We are businesses that pay, a lot in taxes more than most. So we want to be responsible business members and join associations to show that we are positive and good people. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Allison? Seeing none, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming down.
Thank you.
And finally, I have Mr. Robert Dyer in the empty seat. And Mr. Daggerland, your name and address for the record, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Nils Deggerland, 3900 Plaque Road, North Pole, Alaska. First of all, I want to appreciate the fact that you are commenting on this proposed regulation change and taking advantage of this opportunity and seeking some clarification in anticipation of how it might affect us here locally. But I would ask that you take a stronger stand and actually oppose it on several grounds. Propose the regulation change. One is the procedural aspect and the way this is being presented. This seems like kind of a backdoor approach by the board, and I, for one, don't appreciate that. I like local government. I'd like us to have more power and say on this. And also, we've heard testimony tonight that we've not been very effective in keeping these establishments out of residential areas and areas where there's school buses and that sort of thing. We just add on-site consumption to that. We're compounding the problem. And so I'd like to ask that you take a more positive stand against this allowing of on-site consumption. Also, marijuana is a gateway drug. According to a study issued by the Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health and the City University of New York in conjunction with each other, they found that adults who used cannabis over 3 years were 5 times more likely to develop alcohol problem over those who didn't. If you add to that the McDowell Group study on the economic impact of alcohol abuse in the state of Alaska, we've got a chain of events that's being set up here. The McDowell studies showed that if we were to increase the alcohol tax by 10 times, we wouldn't come close to touching the negative impact of alcohol in our society here in the state of Alaska. Now, the impact to us is huge. The alcohol industry doesn't come close to paying its way in our state. We've got one study which says it's a gateway drug to alcoholism, and another study which says alcoholism is severely impacting our state. We need to take a stand and say that's enough. We need to stop this. And so you have the opportunity to do that. And I encourage you to read both of those reports. The one is by the Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health in conjunction with the City University of New York, and the other one is the McDowell Group study on the economic impacts of alcohol abuse. Put those two together and you see we've got a pathway to a lot of trouble. And so you have the opportunity to make a clear statement saying, don't open this door. We can't afford it. We really can't. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dagerlin. Let's see if there are questions for you. Seeing none, we appreciate your coming down. So I have an empty seat. We're at the end of our list. So if there's someone that wishes to speak, now would be the time to take that seat. Mr. Dyer, your name and address for the record, please.
Robert Dyer, 2439 Gulfport. Just wanted to say, before you consider even having on-site consumption, try to go for testing first. Kind of those who don't learn from history are due to repeat it. We learned from alcohol. It causes problems, and then we created ways to test it. Why don't we come up with the test and then say you can smoke it on site or whatever. And yeah, I understand that they want to be like bars, and you want to go to a place and smoke it, but you can't buy a beer from a bar and walk outside and drive home with it. You have to drink it at the bar. And you can't take whatever is left from the beer and take it home. Or you can't go to Fred Meyer's and buy a six-pack and drink it there on site. It's an either or. So, I don't know. Anyways, and kind of the thing is, I just ate 3 edibles, and here I'm feeling really good. What if I said I just drank a six-pack before I came here? Do you think I would have this same welcome as that? Or how many people would be going outside walking after me with 911 on their phone, see if I'd get into a vehicle as I drive away, but not with somebody that says I just smoked 16 bowls and came into this. It's both still mind-altering, still slows your reaction time. Why is one such a superior and not the others, and not the other? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. Let's see if there are questions for you. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming down. So I have another empty seat. If there's someone that wishes to speak, now would be the time to fill that. Sir, your name and address for the record, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is George Salmon, and I live at 8208 Crossman Road, Fairbanks.
Thank you.
I just was listening to the Burrell discussion today on this, and I'm not really certain what you guys are working on, but I had a few comments about marijuana overall. When people start making opinions about this and that, or even quoting some studies, it's really good to know what they're talking about. Who funded the study? What was the sample? Was it a sample? Was it a type of study that was a random controlled study? The one the gentleman just did quote those two, that one group and the other study. It couldn't have been a random controlled study. It was a statistical study. But then again, you got to look at what was the sample? How many people in Alaska do they look at? You got to look at the same thing nationwide. Just because you're a pollster doesn't mean you're going to get the truth all the time. Otherwise, I think we would have had a different president. I don't know. Is marijuana covered just in the federal drug laws, or is it the Constitution? I never saw the Constitution when I was in high school. That's one comment I have. The other comment I have, I've done marijuana a long time ago, and the last year for pain, low back pain, I didn't do it in the daytime. I didn't do it when I drive because I would be impaired. Even if you do marijuana with low THC, which is the part that gets you high, you can buy it with low THC in all these shops around, most of them. And there is one farmer I know that raises it as low THC. And that's mainly the other stuff that causes the pain reduction and some of the other things. PBS had a show on it about 2 years ago, I think it was, a 2-hour show about marijuana. And they had such things as one doctor was completely against it his whole life until his wife went out and bought some at a parking lot from these kids. I don't know if you guys remember this. His son was going through chemo, and he couldn't keep anything down. It was really bad. So his wife went and got this marijuana, smoked out in the parking lot before his son got chemo. The doc walks in, and they're laughing and talking, and he had just gone through chemo. He went there to be with them. And that's not just one incident or one case study. That is a case study, but that's just telling you some of the things that you can learn about marijuana. The other thing they had in that program was the incidence of cancer with people who smoke marijuana compared to people who smoke tobacco. I can't give you the study, and I can't tell you what the sample was. Again, I should have brought that here. One question I had when I listened to one of your previous meetings was that how do you tell what's impaired? You know, what is impairment? I know there's been enough research on alcohol to tell you at what level people start to be affected in their driving skills and decision skills and reaction times. I don't know if anything had been done on marijuana. That question came up before the world before. And at this point in time, I don't know if there's enough research to really tell you what level of THC or whatever in your bloodstream would make you impaired. But I imagine we could, in a short period of time, do I still have time?
You don't.
One last thing. We have enough evidence of what is impairment physically for an officer to test you out on the street. You don't have to have a blood level test.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you leave, let's see if there are any questions for you. Any questions for Mr. Salmon? Seeing none, thank you for coming down. We appreciate it. So I have another empty seat for anyone that wishes to speak. Your name and address for the record, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Christopher Thompson, 3755 Swenson Avenue.
Thank you.
Thank you for this chance to speak. I appreciate it. Since we're a democracy, I'd like to show my support with the on-site consumption. I feel that it's well within our rights to, because there are wine tastings, there are beer tastings constantly all the time. So why should you hold cannabis to a higher standard than liquor? I've heard many different comments about fear-mongering about driving and DUIs. We can implement the same things, such as taxis, Ubers. There's no reason to that we should not be able to have on-site consumption, because, and also the secondhand smoke things I've heard are completely wrong, because the regulations state that they have to be in a separate room that is well ventilated. It's not going to be with everyone else. And so I will go to the bars all the time, and there's still a lot that are still not smoke-free. And I have to breathe cancerous air constantly. This won't happen in these retail locations. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Thompson? Mr. Davies.
Are you suggesting that the primary reason why you want on-site consumption is just for tasting, or do you think, or does the industry want to have?
Yeah, tasting. I mean, 70% of the borough wants it here. I mean, if you don't like to be around it, you can always move to North Pole. But the reason that my reason for it is I want to be able to taste the different types of products before I go purchase it.
So my question is about differentiating between just tasting versus consumption on site.
So you mean like versus eating an edible or smoking on site?
Yeah. And to recreationally in a bar, to sit there and so I've heard two different things. I'm just trying to get what it is that people are really wanting.
I don't really see people sitting there and smoking all day long. It's not like at a bar where someone that doesn't want to go home sits and drinks all day. It's more just for sampling. It's not people aren't. I mean, pods usually aren't here. They're going there to go stay there all day. They're going to go home and play video games or go be with their families or do their own thing.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Any last questions? Mr. Roberts.
Do you think that they should have a rule saying no video games in these places so that they won't be tempted to stay there and they'll go home?
I mean, if that'll make you happy, Lance, I'd be fine with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one last empty seat. And, sir, your name and address for the record, please.
It's Carl Huff. I live at 1062 Steel Creek Road, Hough.
Thank you.
Carl with a K.
Thank you.
I don't really have a lot to say about this. I'm not really sure whether this resolution does anything or not. But I think that we should allow the on-site consumption in some way. I think that's a natural progression, and I don't think the fact that no other state has done it yet. I mean, we used to have bumper stickers that said we don't care how they do it on the outside. We should be leaders up here. We're all young and strong, and I don't see why we should wait for somebody else to do this first. The subject's come up several times about testing for impairment. And, I mean, we've seen this go with alcohol from, well, just go home and, you know, be good and don't do this anymore. That's the way it was when I grew up. I was stopped when I was a kid for drinking and driving, and the state trooper said, Mr. Huff, we want you to go straight home now. You're obviously impaired. Some people didn't think that was far enough, so we set a standard of 0.1, and then that wasn't good enough, so it's whatever it is now, 0.8, 08. You know, that's all right. You can do that with alcohol, but even that test doesn't really prove you're impaired. And I think that we've gotten away from the standard, from the definition of impaired is when you do something wrong or when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. If you're not operating your vehicle properly, if you're crossing the center line or something and a cop sees you weaving, you're impaired. Whether you took opioids or whether you smoked pot, you're impaired. And at that point, he has the right to challenge you for your right to keep driving. But the fact that you have something in your blood that you did 2 or 3 days ago doesn't mean you're impaired necessarily. You might be driving perfectly well. So that's a point that I think is kind of moot. I don't think we really have to have that test, and I even kind of reject the idea that we should be able to call somebody impaired just because they have something in their blood. Like I said, I'm not sure whether this resolution is going to be effective or not, or really what effect it will have, but it certainly let a lot of people come down here and vent their spleen. And apparently that's important too, and that's a function of this government. There seems to be, and one thing that is kind of encouraging to me is a number of the people who've come down here and complained about it said they also don't like alcohol. And I think I've always felt there's kind of people that just really would like to restrict everything that they don't do, every kind of temptation. You know, people just want law against every temptation so that they can be good people. We're supposed to be free and brave, and you have to be brave to be free. So I'm kind of reject that idea too.
Thank you, Mr. Howe. Let's see if there are questions for you. Seeing none, thank you. We appreciate you coming down. Mr. Shields, your name and address for the record, please.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Robert Shields. My address is 145 Martin Drive. This is not why I came down here to speak tonight, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. I've just heard a lot of things that I wanted to briefly comment on. And on the issue of on-site consumption, the only thing that I would ask this assembly consider is that cannabis be treated on par with alcohol and tobacco, period. No special discriminations, just on par with alcohol and tobacco. The issue of on-site consumption does not excuse irresponsible behavior. And I think that there's a level of personal responsibility both on the consumer side as well as on the business side to see that's going to happen. It's shown that it can happen with alcohol establishments. So again, I would just ask that you consider that cannabis be treated on par with alcohol and tobacco. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. Let's see if there are questions. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming down. So I'm going to, seeing no one else coming forward, I'm going to close public hearing, and we are going to take 10-minute break or 5-minute break? 5-minute break. And then, so we're going to recess for 5 minutes, and we'll be back at 9:30. Okay, that was a short break, and we are back. So we're back. It's about 9:35, and we've just closed public hearing on Resolution 2017-42. Look for a motion.
Approve. Second. Davies moved.
Thank you. So you move to adopt. Mr. Davies has moved to adopt. It's seconded by Mr. Cooper. And that leads us with assembly debate and discussion. Mr. Roberts is going to lead us off.
Well, there's a lot to say about this. So first I want to mention head on what I consider kind of a myth that's being put out, that this is only about expressing some regulation changes. You know, on the face of it, that's what it does. But if you look at the language here, the regulation should contain, they're basically stating that we want these regulations, we just want them to be different. And so my opinion is, and what I will give all my testimony on, is that we should say no. We don't want these regulations. And if you wanted to say we don't want these regulations, but if you were going to have them, this should be changed, something like that. This is basically an implicit approval asking for a few changes. And I mean, I think most of those changes are good and necessary, mostly because the regulations are so bad to start with. And so some of these point out some good things. You know, you can't protect people from smoke, as has been pointed out. There is just no way to protect them from the secondhand smoke. There isn't good enough ventilation out there. So to start with, of course, I'm going to reiterate some of what's already been said in public testimony, but the 2014 initiative didn't allow this. This is not what anybody voted on. This is not what was put in front of the voters. They voted for 4 specific license types, which were laid out. And the legislature didn't add this in. They haven't passed any legislation adding in new license types or any type of on-site consumption. This is something completely being done by a board. And so boards are pretty powerful in our state, and they can put forth some strong regulations. And it's hard to stop them because the lieutenant governor can't even stop their regulations. You really have to go to court and stop them. And so I think it's really sad that the Marijuana Control Board has decided to take this tack, and it's just the way it ended up. We ended up with an industry-controlled Marijuana Control Board, as we've seen in a lot of their decisions, and now they're looking at bringing this, which just has there's just no reasonable basis for bringing forward regulations like this with the kind of problems that this can cause. So we've already talked about the secondhand smoke. Oh, also it's in that same 2014 initiative that people voted for. It's illegal to smoke pot in public. It includes public buildings, includes outdoors. I mean, that's a pretty broad definition. It means you can do it in your home. That's what it means. You know, 2014 initiative gave people the right to smoke it in their home and to possess it, transport it, buy it, but not to go consume it somewhere else. We learned our lesson before with alcohol, and we separate these places. They're not even regulating it like alcohol. In alcohol, you've got separate places. Package stores are different than places you go consume. Even in America, they're not really doing this. You know, they do it, but even in Amsterdam, they've got regulations, and they're making them stronger to stop what's been going on because it's been getting out of hand. Regulations that we don't even have, for example, there, if you have over 15% THC, they consider it hard drugs. It's a completely different category. We have no limits here. And they have places in Colorado doing 100% in their concentrates. So that can have quite an effect on people. So one of the things that are in the regulations that is addressed in this resolution is the fact that they're saying it's okay to do it outdoors. So as many of you know from this past campaign, there are a lot of these places right next to or in neighborhoods. They're right there, and now they're going to be smoking outdoors next to these neighborhoods. By the way, these places can be open until 5 in the morning, remember. This isn't just a come by in the daytime thing or something. This is all night long. I'll talk about that later. So I think one person actually brought up that you could have a designated driver. Well, no, that's the difference between alcohol and marijuana. A prime difference is the delivery system used, okay? Smoking is much different than a drink. A drink is contained. One person can consume it. Smoke affects people. The director of health, or whatever his position is for the state, this summer at the UAF summer sessions did a presentation on the health effects of marijuana and pointed out that there's a measurable amount of THC in people who get it secondhand. He had numbers up there and a graph and all that. So it's not a nothing. It does affect people, and especially if you think about if it's somebody who doesn't consume, maybe that's why they're the designated driver. Well, now that little bit could be enough for them because they're not even used to it. I mean, there's no range of moderation, but, you know, people aren't even used to it all. It could be quite a different experience for them. That's most of the reasons. Basically, this is going to be an experiment that we're going to try. We're not going to wait to see what happens elsewhere and figure it out and try to make good rules based on all that. We're just going to do an experiment. Now, it's actually not that much of an experiment, actually, because we did this once in America back in the 19th century. They were called opium dens, and they're gone now because they weren't a good thing. We did learn a lesson, and I guess history's repeating itself, and now maybe we'll have to learn that lesson again. But these establishments are not going to be positive things, and if we have any resolution, it should be one saying we don't want it. Let's not be the experiment. Don't make rules the people didn't vote for, and just wait and see what happens. Gather data. You know, it's obviously going to be here to stay for a while, so we'll have plenty of time to see how it affects without these places. And as one testifier pointed out, other states may implement it, and we can watch them and see what they do and see from their mistakes. We've seen plenty of other mistakes from the other states that have legalized before us, and lots of bad stats out there. If you want to go study it, you'll be overwhelmed with stats. But anyway, I'm asking everyone to vote no on this resolution because I don't think it's appropriate for us to support any level of regulations dealing with on-site consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Next, I have Mr. Cooper, and then I have Mr. Tackey.
Thanks. And, I appreciate all the testimony tonight. And just one thing I want to reiterate and perhaps disagree with Mr. Roberts on a little bit is that this somehow approves or disapproves of on-site consumption. I think from my perspective, the concern I have is that, the borough is left naked if it doesn't provide some input, because I don't think that this assembly is likely to, adopt a resolution outright supporting on-site consumption, as proved the last time this resolution came up, and I think it's highly unlikely this assembly would approve a resolution outright asking for prohibition of on-site consumption. So in that context, it makes sense to me that we should look at the areas where we have concerns, the things that we've heard from folks who've testified and come before us over the months and years about the effects of marijuana, and at least offer those to the Marijuana Control Board as something to consider, because otherwise our voice isn't heard at all. And so I guess as a counterpoint to Mr. Roberts' point, remaining silent on these things isn't going to do us any good. And if the Marijuana Control Board does adopt regulations, I don't know if they will or not. I'm certain that they've heard from lots of people over the state, both pro and con on this issue, and who knows what they'll do. But if they do adopt regulations, it should be with some input, and I think some input from us, who have heard a lot from all of those out in the public about what their concerns are. And so, I guess I fundamentally disagree that it's an implicit endorsement of on-site consumption so much as it is an opportunity to make sure that if those regulations are adopted, that there is strong local control. And really that's what it comes down to, I think, for me, is that this is an issue that should be decided locally. I don't want vagueness in the regulations so that we don't have a say on how on-site consumption is instituted in the Fairbanks North Star Borough. If it is, that is a policy decision that will come to us down the road if the state adopts these regulations. We're not there yet. But if they do, I think there would be a mistake, at least, not to have our voice heard.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Next, I have Mr. Tackey, and then Mr. Davies and Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Ms. Dodge. I kind of have a question for the attorney in regards to Alaska statutes. I think the way ballot measure 2 was written was that there is local control. We can have any additional regulations or rules put on these businesses that we would, without it having to be specified in the regulations that the board passes.
We do have local control, but that statute's been amended so that it's non-area wide, but you can do time, place, and manner regulations.
Okay. And so that would lead me to wonder if number 1 and 2 would even be necessary on our resolution, since we would be able to have manner and control of what is permitted at a retail establishment, which is just an on-site endorsement for retail establishments.
I agree. I think it's maybe unnecessary. However, in parts of the regulations, they do have language regarding local control, so I think it was a general statement of clarification, but I'll defer to the sponsors as to their intent on that one.
Okay, then to the sponsors.
You wish to?
From my perspective, that's correct. I think that because the regulations talked about local control and talked about local control inconsistently within various portions of the regulations, it was important to emphasize that it needs to be consistent and needs to emphasize local control.
Okay. I'm going to move to amend. I want to remove number 6 regarding whether outdoor consumption by inhalation should be permitted given the potential conflicts with adjoining property owners over odor mitigation. Technically, anyone that is in their own...
Why don't we see if you get a second before we...
Sorry.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Tacky and seconded by Mr. Lawrence to delete item 6. The AMCB should consider whether outdoor consumption by inhalation should be permitted, given potential conflicts with adjoining property owners over odor mitigation. And then to the motion?
And the justification for that would be that individuals already who are permitted to consume on their own personal property, they are actually allowed to do it outdoors. I could be on the very edge of my lot and smoke, and anything that comes over into another neighbor's property is not going to get them intoxicated in any way, shape, or form. The outdoor angle of it dissipating so quickly is actually a better situation than actually having everyone locked in a room together if your concern was secondhand inhalation of cannabis smoke. And so I think that keeping outdoor consumption available for these retail establishments is a better consideration. We should let that go.
Okay, so I have Mr. Roberts on the amendment, and...
Yeah, so I would like to point out that it doesn't say because we're worried about the kids getting stoned next door. It's because we're worried about odor mitigation. And so however fast it dissipates, I can tell you as somebody who lives next to somebody who implements that rule, that it doesn't stop odor. So I would just like to point that out, that's what this is talking about, is odors.
Any other discussion on the amendment? Mr. Cooper.
And I'll just note, I mean, and this one was one I think that it's worded a little bit carefully in that it's suggesting that AMCV consider that as an issue as opposed to trying to prohibit outdoor consumption, but just to take into account that that's been an issue locally that people have talked to us about has been odor.
Right.
Any other comment on the amendment? Yes, Mr. Quist.
Thank you. Well, in response to Mr. Cooper's statement, I mean, the way I read this, it seems like it's calling for the AMCB to consider prohibition of, consumption by inhalation outdoors. Am I reading it correctly? And I guess that's to the sponsor.
I guess my intent would be that they consider the issue, to look at both sides of it.
So, and if I could follow up then. So, I mean, I would speak in support of the amendment because I think that, for a couple of reasons. One, I think that these kinds of potential conflicts are exactly the kinds of things that we should be addressing here at the assembly level. And it's something that I think that we need to address, not just in terms of consumption, but also, I mean, it's been an issue with cultivation. I think it's something that's also not just confined to this industry. I think there are many industries that make odors, and that we need to figure out how to be neighborly, with commercial entities and residences. So that's to the odor issue. Also, I would say that when you prohibit people from smoking outdoors, that means it's going to happen inside, and that's a less safe way to for it to be consumed, because if it's outdoors, it will dissipate. So I mean, we are moving, I think, in general, as a society away from indoor smoking of multiple kinds of drugs, and I think that if that really only leaves outdoor, I guess. So I would speak against considering prohibiting outdoor consumption by inhalation. Thank you.
Any other comments on the or discussion on the proposed amendment to remove item 6? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll, and it's certainly not going to carry any main motion.
Mr. Davies?
Yes.
Mr. Satley?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
5-4.
the amendment passes 5-4. So I'm back to my list. Mr. Davies, you're next.
I think my question was already dealt with.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gray?
Mine was too.
Thank you. Any other? Yes, Mr. Roberts.
So I'd like to amend line 55. After regulate, put the words or prevent. I'll speak to it if I get a second.
Let's see. On line 55, you say? Okay, got it. Regulate or prevent. So Mr. Roberts has proposed amending line 55 to read regulate or prevent on-site consumption, and that's been seconded by Mr. Satley. Would you like to speak to the amendment, Mr. Roberts?
Yes, I just want to, without knowing all the intricacies of the statute involved here, I want to make sure that if this assembly decides, they can say no to on-site consumption and not just regulate it, but to go that full length of being able to say no. All the local municipalities should have that option. Since it's not a license type, which is how the statute is set up, I want to make sure that with their extra little add-on that we're still able to implement that prevention.
On the amendment, are there other comments? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
I move to amend the amendment to replace prevent with prohibit.
Is there a second? So it's been moved by Mr. Lawrence and seconded by Mr. Gray, I believe, to amend the amendment so that it would read or prohibit on-site consumption.
No objection.
Yeah, I don't care.
Any objection to that proposed amendment? Mr. Quist, are you objecting to that? Or?
No, I'm not. I have a question.
Okay, can I? Oh, okay.
and a
About
comment
the proposed
on
amendment
the
to
amendment.
the amendment to the
Before
amendment?
we vote.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, this seems fine to me. I think that we should have the ability to prohibit if we so choose. But I guess my question is for the attorney, does this substantially change this? I mean, when I read this, I kind of felt like that meant that we could prohibit, even though the word prohibit wasn't there, if it was, interpreted the way that it's written, or that's the way I interpret it.
I think it's probably just a clarification more than a major substantive change to the resolution.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, my question's been answered. Thank you.
Okay. So let's vote on the.
I wasn't trying to object. I just had.
Yeah,
a
I
question.
understand. Okay. So is there any objection to? Well, let's vote on the proposed. The amendment to the amendment. Is there any objection to the amendment to the amendment? Let's start there. Thank you. That's what I was trying to get to. Now let's vote on the proposed amended amendment, or the amendment as amended.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Tackey?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Satley?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Davies?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none, it's approved. Thank you. We're back to the main motion as amended, and I have no one else on my list. Yes, Mr. Tackey.
I guess I was going to ask about number 3 and if the drafters had looked into the differences between tobacco smoke and cannabis smoke in relation to cancer-causing activities and the problems that are associated with secondhand smoke.
Is there anyone that wishes to respond to that? Mr. Davies.
I haven't personally looked into the exact differences with respect to that, but I just my sense is that we should be careful about any kind of secondhand smoke. Period. That's just my general concern, I've had quite a number of people who were active in the anti-smoking regulations contact me in that regard. That they're concerned about that. We have a significant concern about PM 2.5, and so the basis for my concern is largely based on that, about the dangers of any particle being ingested, and I'm not trying to suggest that somebody shouldn't smoke marijuana if they choose to. I'm just saying that we need to be careful that that choice doesn't impact on somebody else, and I'm just asking the board to consider that. And at least that's the way I read this.
Mr. Tacky?
So did it seem that it was not strong enough based on having a separate room for employees in the regulations? To the drafter that put it in. I mean, whoever was one of...
Anyone wish to respond to?
Yes, it didn't seem strong enough. And
they had a different space to...
Right. From my perspective, and I think, even more importantly than that, we have this statewide initiative that we are a part of now by unanimously adopting a smoke-free workplace resolution. That part of the intent here is to convey that to the AMCB as well. This is important to this borough.
Mr. Davies, I have you next.
Okay, just generally, one of the issues that got raised several times was that there aren't any examples of alcohol places where you can consume on site, and that I just wanted to point out that that's simply not true, because there are a number of places where microbreweries are produce on site, sell on site, and people consume there. Now there are limitations as to how much you consume, and there's limitations on the hours. But that it's a kind of equivalent to a wine tasting situation where you would go to a winery that grows the grapes and processes and bottles, and then tasting room, and you can taste a certain amount on site. So I'm not saying that necessarily I would support the idea that would be the only way that could go, but I'm just saying that that's clearly an example of. And from the alcohol side of the situation, that there is on-site consumption.
I have Mr. Roberts next.
Well, I was actually going to give up on my former point, figured it was covered well enough, but I actually want to mention something on this, and I've read through all those regs. I don't have them in front of me handy, but it seemed to me that the amount that they're allowing, if you look at how much marijuana it takes to get to a high state, it isn't that much, and the amount of marijuana they're selling is large compared to that amount, whereas the amount of alcohol they have in like a distillery, for their samples is small compared to the amount it would take the average person to get intoxicated. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. Depends on what it is and body weight and all that. But I am saying that I don't think that they are tailoring the allowed amount to be purchased and sampled based on those considerations to where it would only be a sample. Of course, as this assembly knows, I've maintained that there's almost no amount that you can consume and not reach that high, because that's the difference between mind-altering drugs and alcohol. But I think even those who disagree with me would realize that it takes much less quantity of that to reach that state, and that the regulations are not taking that into account. Thanks.
So next I have Mr. Lawrence and then Mr. Quist.
I don't have any technical expertise about chemicals, but I can assure you that from my perspective, alcohol is a mind-altering drug, or most people wouldn't bother drinking it. And I agree with that this smoke-free workplace resolution, and I'm in favor of that. But my recollection and understanding of the proposed Marijuana Control Board proposed regulations would have those customers who are choosing to sample, and therefore, obviously will be exposed to the smoke that's in that room, being observed by employees in a different room, I think looking through a window. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to totally eliminate the problem, but I think the regs as they stand now addresses that issue. And, obviously the people who choose to sample are choosing to consume THC through the air, through their own lungs, and also the secondhand smoke of the people they're smoking with. And so I'm in favor of smoke-free workplace, but I think the Marijuana Control Board has shown that it's concerned about that and is addressing that issue. One other matter.
Yes.
Okay, just in principle, I think regulated on-site consumption is something that is reasonable, that the people of this state should be able to do. And the idea that you should only be able to consume marijuana or inside your home, I think is absurd. When you think about where people can smoke cigarettes, people can consume alcohol, it's just, there's no logical basis for that.
So I have Mr. Quist, Mr. Tackey, and Mr. Davies. Mr. Quist. Mr. Gray.
I'd like to move to amend on line 61 to change the word stronger to the word strong.
So is there a second to changing the words on line 61, is there a second to changing the word stronger to strong on line 61? Mr. Davies, are you holding your hand up as a second, or are you holding your hand up to speak to things?
Was there a second?
I haven't heard a second yet.
I'll second.
Okay, Mr. Lawrence has seconded. So Mr. Quist has moved that we amend line 61 so that it reads, the regulation should contain strong protections from cannabis smoke, and that's been seconded by Mr. Lawrence. And I think, Mr. Davies, do you have your hand up? Mr. Quist, do you want to speak to the amendment?
Thank you. I chose to amend this here. I mean, my initial inclination was to move to entirely delete this because I really don't think it's necessary, because the draft regulations currently contain very strong protections for workers. I mean, if this existed, in the tobacco world, like if you could only smoke a cigarette in a bar in a separate room where the wait staff wasn't, I mean, it would be very different than the way we do business currently. So I think the draft regulations currently contain strong protections. I think strong protections are fine. I don't think that they need to be stronger. I don't know how much stronger it can possibly be. So so that's why I'm choosing to amend it. I would be open to amendments to that amendment, though.
Is there any discussion on this amendment, proposed amendment? It looks like, is there any objection to this proposed amendment? Yeah, well, Mr. Roberts is objecting. Okay. Is there further discussion on this proposed amendment?
Yes, I'll speak
to it. Yes, Mr. Roberts.
I think we need to send a strong message, and that means using the word stronger, to make sure that they get what's really important to us. He mentioned about the current situation. Well, we voted for that current situation to change when we voted for this smoke-free resolution. That situation will go away if that ever passes at the state level. And so I think we need to have this language as strong as possible. And so I would say let's not vote for this amendment.
Okay. Anyone else on this amendment? Yes, Mr. Davies.
I just want to support it. I think that I take the criticism that it doesn't necessarily need to be stronger than the smoke-free workplace protections. So I think, which are pretty strong, and also given that there are some attempts within the proposed regulations to be mindful of that. I think that the reason why I would argue strongly to keep this in here, though, as potentially amended, would be to make sure that when the final regulation come out, that they don't backslide.
Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Are we ready to vote? I think we are, Clerk.
Mr. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Cooper.
Yes.
Mr. Satley.
Yes.
Mr. Quist.
Yes.
Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Mr. Roberts.
No.
Mr. Tackey.
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence.
Yes.
Ms. Dodge.
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none.
One.
It is adopted 8-1. We are back to my list. And Mr. Quist, are you done on my?
That was the amendment I have. I would like to make just one kind of general comment on this topic of on-site consumption as it compares to alcohol establishments. The point was made earlier that there are places that you can go where you can purchase a sample, which might be up to like 2 pints of beer or 2 shots of gin, and you can consume them on site. And then you can also purchase a package that you can't consume on site, either in the form of a bottle of vodka or a growler of beer, and you can take that with you. And this is something that I think is actually popular and well regulated. And the only other thing that I would add is that 2 pints of beer has a significant mind altering effect on the consumer, and I think we take it seriously, and I think that we are taking these proposed regulations seriously as well. Thank you.
So I have Mr. Tackey next, and then Davies and Gray.
I was going to move to amend line 69 through 71, and it was just to strike number 5, as I think that they don't need to take another harder look on whether or not having a separate room is a sufficient protection. That's basically what we had discussed, and we think it already does contain strong protections. So rather than reconsidering and looking at this separate room area for employees.
Let me see if you get a second.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a second for removing Section 5, which is lines 69 through 71?
I'll second for discussion, I guess.
It's been seconded by Mr. Gray, so I'm sorry, Mr. Tackey, continue your explanation, please.
Summed it up, actually.
Okay. Mr. Roberts and any on the amendment.
So I'd like to point out, if we're going to have employee oversight of consumption, if they're going to be evaluating their customers to make sure that they haven't gone too far, they're going to use some level of discretion. It's probably not going to be through a window, looking at them through a window into a smoke-filled room, trying to make that decision. At some point, they have to come into contact. They're going to have to enter that room. They may be able to stay in the other room most of the time, but they're going to have to enter that room. So I don't think that is sufficient. I'm not sure how to get to sufficient, but I think it's an issue that definitely needs to be thought about, and so I think this paragraph is important.
Thank you. And then I have Mr. Cooper and then Mr. Tackey.
Yeah, I think that Mr. Roberts kind of summarized. The question I have had about this is if you have employees who are tasked with monitoring somebody and their consumption, but they're monitoring through a window, how that works and how that actually allows them to be cognizant of how much a person has consumed and whether or not they have consumed too much or whatever. It's like I think about a bar situation. The bartender doesn't just shovel people off to a back room. They're constantly observing the patrons in a bar and walking around. And I think, going to the smoke-free workplace issue, I think that ultimately if the state does adopt a smoke-free workplace, that will provide bartenders and bars that serve alcohol a smoke-free workplace as well. So, it's just something to think about. Does that really protect workers? Are they going to have to go into the room where people are smoking cannabis? And maybe you've been involved in the process. Perhaps maybe you know the answer to that about how that protects.
Well, I mean, if that's back to me.
Mr. Tackey, you're next.
So the way the current regulation is written, it says that it has to have a ventilation system that removes all visible smoke. So it's not a smoke-filled room as Mr. Roberts had illustrated. It's actually going to be clear so you could see everybody, and there is a window then for being able to observe individuals and their behaviors and how they're acting to pick up on whether or not someone's overconsumed something. But I've been to several bars where, I get my drinks right there from the bartender, but then I go up into a separate room where nobody really walks by or comes back and checks on you. So I don't think that this section is necessary, because I do think that would be an adequate separation for employees.
Any other comments or discussion, Mr. Roberts, on the amendment?
I guess I'd also mention that, if something goes on, some ruckus happens, and somebody has to intervene, that they're going to have to enter that room. And so that needs to be taken into consideration. That's going to be an employee of some type.
Okay. Any other discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Davies?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Satley?
No.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
2-7.
it fails 2-7. We're back to the main motion as amended. And my list, let's see, Mr. Davies, I have you next, I believe. You're done? Mr. Gray?
Well, yeah, honestly, I'm torn on this resolution. I'm listening to all the testimony tonight from the public and from the assembly members. I sponsored this again to try to find some middle ground. I think we're having a hard time finding it. I would be happy if it just clarified the local control point. Honestly, I think the rest could be handled with the local control clause of this when and if that time comes. We're going to have that discussion again. Just a couple other points. Something that kept coming up that I keep hearing is that the Marijuana Control Board is industry dominated. There's only 2 positions that are industry representatives, and the chair of that is a staunch prohibitionist. So I don't see that board as being industry dominated in any way. Designated driver issue. They don't have to be in the same building where this is being consumed. That's not. We're not saying that designated drivers are going to be in the same room where people are consuming if this was to come to pass. And then the thing about tourism. It's not just tourists that don't necessarily have a legal place to consume. There are thousands of renters in the borough and city that quite possibly, as it stands right now, could be breaking their lease or rental agreements with a landlord that are not legally consuming in a property that they are renting or leasing. So it's not just about tourism. There are quite possibly a lot of people that are not having a legal place to consume in this borough and city. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. So I'm at the list. I'm at the end of my list. It is all checked off and scratched. Oh, okay. Mr. Quist and then Mr. Tackey.
I would just like to point out that this has been a very open and deliberative process and in no way seems like ramrodding to me. Thank you.
Mr. Tackey.
I was just going to say my piece on how I'm going to vote for this resolution. I obviously want the borough to take on-site consumption and endorse actual regulations for on-site consumption, which this doesn't do. It doesn't say we want an on-site consumption regulations passed. It merely states, here's some comments and concerns. And part of my concerns with, hey, here's more changes we want, is that has been like the way to keep kicking this can down the road and keep altering it and changing the regulations enough so that way they never have to be adopted. So the way it's written right now, I would have to vote no for it.
Okay, Mr. Davies.
I guess I reject having other people tell me what my motives are here, so I want to tell you what my motive is, and it's very consistent with what Mr. Cooper said earlier, is that I think, for one thing, there is an open comment period right now, so we're not trying to kick this down the road. We're trying to get in under the wire to make our comments while the comment period's open. On the other hand, by doing that, I don't think that we're taking a position one way or the other on whether we want to have on-site consumption. And I have my own opinions on that, but I'm not sharing them right now because I don't think that's what this resolution is about. This resolution is about actually responding to that open comment period that's there right now and saying, if you do this, then here's some things that we would like you to consider in the process of doing it. We're not saying you should do it or not, but if you do it, there's some things. And of course, I agree, the strongest thing in here is that we want to reiterate the fact that, and I agree it's a little redundant, but I think it's a little redundancy in a lot of kinds of communications is not untoward, that we want local control. That's the, when it comes, if it ever comes back to us, we want to be able to have meaningful discussion at the local level as to how we regulate it. So that's my motivation here.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. As always, Mr. Davies says it better than I can, so I endorse Mr. Davies' statement. And I guess I'll just add to that. I think that we are in a unique position because we have been, this borough has been dealing with cannabis for a lot longer than other parts of the state. We've dealt with it in depth. We've learned a lot from that, and I think that some of these comments distill what we've learned and what we've heard, and so I think we should take that opportunity to provide comments. This is an open comment period for making rules that are going to apply to everybody across the state. We know something, we should provide what we know. So, thank you.
Okay. My list is Mr. Roberts.
Well, everyone knows how I'm going to vote, but I certainly agree that comments should be made, and I will be turning mine in. And hopefully they'll take them into consideration. As I pointed out at the very beginning, I'm kind of didn't like the tone, though I recognize the argument. If it was said differently, it'd have less chance of passing. That's how these things work sometimes. But anyway, I just want to point that out, that definitely can still make comments till tomorrow to the state board, anyone who wants to do that.
Okay. Any last comment? To this board, not the state board. Seeing none, clerk, I think we're ready to vote on the resolution as amended.
Madam Chair, Mr. Cooper.
Yes.
Mr. Quist.
Yes.
Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Mr. Tackey.
No.
Mr. Roberts.
No.
Mr. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Satley.
No.
Mr. Lawrence.
Yes.
And Ms. Dodge.
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
6-3.
it's adopted 6-3.
For immediate reconsideration.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Lawrence and seconded by Mr. Cooper for immediate reconsideration. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Roberts.
Yes.
Mr. Tackey.
Yes.
Mr. Gray.
No.
Mr. Satley.
Yes.
Mr. Quist.
No.
Mr. Davies.
No.
Mr. Cooper.
No.
Mr. Lawrence.
No.
Ms. Dodge.
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
3-6.
the reconsideration fails.